Γεια σας. Καλησπέρα. Stinya mas. Okay, that's enough Greek, I think. Thank you very much, Robert and the Hellenic Association, for inviting me back. Always a pleasure to come to Greece and assimilate myself into Greek culture in many different ways. I mean, obviously, I'd like to talk about the BACB and credentials, but I want to preface some of what I say with more general information about what I think it is to be and say you are a behavior analyst, and also just give a couple of examples of different applications of the science. So that's my broad aim. Also to paint a very brief picture about how things are evolving in Europe in particular. And unfortunately, well, perhaps not unfortunately, I also stand between you and lunch. So I hope you don't get too restless. Oops. Hang on a second. Okay. Now, I gave, as Robert said, I was in New Zealand recently, and I gave a talk in New Zealand where I really wanted to set the scene for becoming credentialed as a behavior analyst by really explaining what that meant and kind of dissecting the words and putting them back together again. And I really wanted to highlight that when we talk about behavior, we talk about it in a slightly different way to how everyone else talks about behavior. When we talk about behavior, we're talking about everything that we do as behavior. You know, and as I'd like to say to my students when they say, oh yeah, but what about that? Well, it's just behavior. So acting, speaking, feeling, and so on, it's just behavior. One of my students once said to me, oh, come on, you can't be serious. What about love? And I said, well, that's just a conditioned positive automatic reinforcement. It just doesn't sound nearly so sexy when you say that to your wife. And I also point this out because of the misunderstanding and misperception of that people have towards us as behavior analysts. So just by way of an example, I was in a school several years ago, and my remit was to look at the problem behavior of 3 or 4 pupils in the school. And I started asking the teacher questions about the curriculum. And she said, why are you asking me about that? And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, you're the behavior guy. Just focus on the behavior, as in the problem behavior. So there was no notion of the connection between all of these different things. Of course, Skinner puts this beautifully and encapsulates the complexity of what it is we're trying to do. So Skinner says, behavior is a difficult subject matter, not because it is inaccessible, but because it is extremely complex. Since it is a process rather than a thing, it cannot be held still for observation. It is changing, fluid, evanescent, and for this reason it makes great technical demands upon the ingenuity and energy of the scientist. Good job, Skinner. And so what do we mean by analysis? This is often misunderstood or at least not understood by many people in the context of us as behavior analysts. Well, it means we use experimentation to determine that what we have done has been effective rather than anything else that's happened in the environment. And what we do in terms of our analysis is we examine environmental contingencies. We look for a relationship between environmental contingencies and behavior. And so in many ways, what we are is probably better encapsulated by the phrase contingency analyst rather than behavior analyst. And I heard you say that at some point, Paul. So behavior analysts are really contingency analysts. What is behavior analysis? Well, it's a natural science approach to behavior change, and it's not a therapy, it's not a treatment, it's not an intervention. I showed a slide in a presentation once. Well, there were 2 slides. One was ABA is, and then I had a number of different descriptors, and the next slide said ABA is not. And one of the, well, there are a couple of things were on that slide. ABA is not a therapy, it's not characterized by one-to-one intervention, it's not just for children with autism, and so on. And I had 3 people come up to me at the end of my presentation and said, there was a typo on your slide. And I said, no, there wasn't. And what is applied behavior analysis? Applied behavior analysis is the use of behavior analytic methods and research findings to change socially important behaviors in meaningful ways, the application of natural science. So when people say things to me like, oh, well, I tried ABA, it didn't work. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because that's the equivalent to saying, well, I tried science, it didn't work. And I suppose similarly, oh, I tried reinforcement, it didn't work. Right, it's crazy. Okay, let's, oops, why is this going forward so quickly? Okay, what is a behavior analyst? Well, we focus on behavior, but as I explained, behavior is everything, so it's a very wide remit. We rely on the scientific literature because we're scientists, and our interests are consistent with that literature. Our theorizing and our practice are grounded in scientific experimentation, so the analysis part. And our interests in behavior are filtered through the philosophical framework of radical behaviorism. So there's a lot more to being a behavior analyst than just the credentials, although I'm going to talk about the credentials, of course. Okay, what does this look like in Europe as an evolving profession? Well, actually, the United States is the only country that actually recognizes behavior analysis as a profession and behavior analysts as professionals. And the picture is very different elsewhere. In France, behavior analysis is not recognized as a profession. Indeed, in France, there's a very strong emphasis on psychoanalytic work and interpretations, particularly with regard to working with children with autism. And if any of you get the opportunity, I would thoroughly recommend you track down a video called The Wall, which is a video of psychoanalytic interpretations of autism in France. So it's a video of French psychoanalysts talking about autism. It's jaw-droppingly both funny and scary at the same time. And after the video was made, the psychoanalysts complained to the filmmaker that they looked stupid in the video, which I thought was quite funny, because they did. You have some behavior analysts in France work in some organizations, but they're very few. Other health professionals in France are tax exempt, so there's a big incentive for the recognition of healthcare professionals in general. And special educators, speech-language therapists or pathologists are trained outside of university settings in France. So only psychologists that go through the university system would probably meet the criteria to pursue certification, at least at this stage. In Iceland, there's no formal recognition of behavior analysts. This is going to be a recurring theme. Behavior analysts work within the boundaries of other licensed professions. There's one centre led by a licensed psychologist who's trained at UCLA in Iceland. In Italy, behavior analysts can only work and practice as behavior analysts if they are licensed psychologists. Behavior analysis courses have been taught covertly. So, just to give an example, some colleagues of mine wanted to set up a master's program in behavior analysis at the university, and the university's reaction was, no way, because of the antipathy towards behavior analysis and the misunderstandings of what it is and so on. So they went away and they came back and said, okay, can we start a master's program in human behavior and learning? And they said, yeah, go for it. But it's the same course, same program. Applied behavior analysts exist independently in Italy, and they're paid directly by consumers. There's no other way of getting funding for that work. And there are no behavior analysts working directly within schools other than in a private capacity, so funded by parents. Norway has a very strong tradition of behaviour analysis. Indeed, the Norwegian Association for Behaviour Analysis is the largest outside the United States, well, some of the big ones in the United States. But only psychologists or medically trained individuals within Norway may have responsibility for treatment and intervention programs. So many behaviour analysts describe what they do in the context of education. Norway is a very forward-thinking place in that families may have whatever they want in terms of intervention for their child with autism or indeed some kind of developmental disability. And if they want applied behaviour analysis, they can have applied behaviour analysis, but then if they want facilitated communication, they could probably have that too. In Portugal, behaviour analysis doesn't exist. Universities typically provide short and fairly rudimentary courses as part of a psychology degree. Applied behaviour analysts exist independently and are paid directly by consumers, so very similar to Italy, and other health and education professionals are tax exempt, so there's another incentive to develop things there. In Spain, there's no formal, don't worry, I'm not going to go through every European country, I'm going to get to the end in a minute. In Spain, there's no recognition, although some individuals working privately. Behaviour analysts there work predominantly within the scope and field of psychology, but there is some recognition in that anyone who has the BCBA credential in Spain is automatically recognised as being or meeting the criteria for working as a licensed psychologist, or whatever the equivalent is in Spain. In Sweden, behaviour analysis is recognised only informally, and its behaviour analytic training is typically sought by occupational therapists, speech-language therapists, and others who want to kind of augment the skills that they have. There's a lot of antipathy in Sweden against behaviour analysis from other professionals, which is also problematic. And finally, through my trawl through Europe, in the UK, there's currently no formal recognition of behaviour analysis, but this is something we're working on. There's a possibility of getting recognition through what's now called the Healthcare Professions Council, and that involves setting up a voluntary register of behaviour analysts working in the UK. So that's what we're pursuing. And you have behaviour analysts typically working, well, many working within academia, but also many working within schools, typically autism and developmental disability type institutions, and some within the NHS as well. Now, of course, there are, well, I say of course, many people think that applied behaviour analysis is an autism intervention. Still, this is fairly commonplace around the world, and it's, in many ways, it's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because now many more people around the world have heard about applied behaviour analysis. And when you meet someone at a party and they ask you what you do and you try and explain to them without them glazing over, many people say, oh yes, I've heard of ABA, that's that autism thing. So that's the double-edged sword element of this. Many people have heard of it, but then many people still think it's just applicable for children with autism. But here are some of, many hundreds, if not thousands, of different applications. And of course, general teaching. There should be behaviour analysts in every classroom. Or classroom management, so it's slightly more specific. Organisational behaviour management. So there could and should be behaviour analysts working in every large organisation and government, of course. Sports training, rehabilitation, for example, after brain injury or stroke. Increasing driver safety. Working with individuals with dementia. Marriage counselling. Yes, marriage counselling. And behavioural intervention for autism. I put that at the end because I want to emphasise that we are much more than that. Now, many of us, I suppose, are worried about the fact that so few people have heard about what we can offer, that our range in terms of applications is, or has been, fairly limited. And of course, we could say with some certainty that ABA has flourished for populations at the ends of this spectrum, particularly in terms of autism and developmental disability. But of course, we can turn our hands to anything. I mean, all voluntary, goal-directed human behavior can be conceptualized as operant behavior maintained by environmental contingencies, and therefore is ripe for us to go into those areas and work and affect great change. And bringing our objective and scientific approach will be and has been hugely helpful in many areas. And I just want to mention two, which I have a particular interest in. There's a growing problem around the world. Well, I suppose addiction in general is a growing problem, both in terms of, you know, obvious things, drug addiction, heroin, cocaine, alcohol, cigarettes, but also gambling and a range of other things. And contingency management is an effective way of addressing that, but is not utilised as much as it could be or should be. So even back in 1969, Schuster and Thompson talked about the behavioural aspects of this. So they say the behavioural aspects of drug dependence can be most profitably interpreted within the framework of operant conditioning principles. So this was identified a long time ago. Now, the basic principles involved in contingency management approach to working with addiction are that you identify your target behaviours, your observable target behaviours, and they are things like, well, abstinence, fairly obviously, or attendance at clinic. And they tend to use predominantly positive reinforcement, but sometimes negative punishment. So the positive reinforcement in terms of things like privileges, vouchers, and money. I want to mention the problematic ethical element of that in a second. The negative punishment aspects could include things like reducing the monetary voucher or the value of vouchers, or losing a deposit, and so on. And just to give you an example from a couple of studies that were published in the 1990s, and the data are fairly typical of the kind of data that's coming out of these contingency management, work. So this was to treat cocaine addiction, and they required that the individuals turn in 3 urine samples each week. And if the urine samples were clean, then they would be given vouchers for that. And using a progressive schedule such that the first voucher you would get for a clean sample would be $2.50. And then if your next sample was clean, it would be $5. And if your next sample was clean, it would be $7.50. But if you provided a non-clean sample, then it would be reset back to $2.50. So the next clean sample, you'd be back to $2.50 again. And here are what the data look like from one of those studies. So the top line is the contingency management approach for the percentage of subjects involved. And the bottom line was the standard counselling offered for that treatment. And what you can see is that the data are relatively stable at around 60%. So the hit rate for the effectiveness of contingency management for this kind of thing is 60%. And many studies have shown it to be around 60%. Now, you could say, well, 60%, that doesn't sound very good, but 60% is a lot better than the alternatives. So for those of you that may be interested in pursuing such either research interest or applied work in this area, there are some interesting research areas, I think, to pursue here. One is how to maximize effectiveness, so how to raise that 60%. One is looking at relapse, because when treatment ends, typically or often relapse happens. the cost effectiveness of this, because, well, actually, it tends not to be expensive, but it's difficult to persuade people to fund a treatment program where essentially you are paying someone to not take drugs or drink or smoke. So there's some ethical issues there, I think. And how to harness the natural contingencies rather than just rely on vouchers or money or whatever it happens to be. Another area that I have become increasingly interested in is the application of behaviour analytic principles to the issue of sustainability or addressing global warming issues. Something that's becoming increasingly problematic, although President Trump doesn't seem to think so. And there are many, many examples of how we could be helpful in this regard. So, you know, just having a look at some fairly recent articles in some of the journals, I came across research projects that were looking to reduce electricity consumption, promote waste management, increase green driving practices, and recycling. Okay, so and many kind of fairly obvious and relatively easy things to address, perhaps. And with that in mind, my wife works with an individual who, whose work to date has been to do with restoration of old buildings. So he was in Romania. He had a connection to Romania. And he was restoring old Austro-Hungarian churches that were hundreds of years old. And last year they were opening, or at least displaying, a newly restored church, and they had invited the local mayor and some celebrities and so on. And he became very aware of the fact that even though the church looked fantastic, the surrounding area was completely littered, many plastic bottles and just other rubbish all over the place. So he became interested in recycling and trying to address that issue. And my wife said to him, "Oh, you should speak to Neil. Neil has a particular interest in that." So now I'm working with him, trying to teach the inhabitants of 3 villages in Transylvania how to recycle their plastic bottles, which is proving interesting and not as easy as I had hoped. Perhaps it was naive of me to think otherwise. Our functional analysis suggested that there are several problems. One is lack of receptacles to recycle. So that seems like a fairly obvious thing to address. Second one is the response effort involved in that. So, you know, how far people have to travel to recycle. A third is their motivation to do this in the first place. And a fourth, which I kind of wasn't expecting but has become increasingly problematic, is the corrupt practices of some of the politicians within Romania that are making this more difficult. But I'm hoping in about a year's time or so that I can show you some of the data to show you how successful or otherwise we've been with this project. But if it is successful, and we do have some support from a major water company, they produce bottled water in Romania, that if we are successful, we can roll it out and maybe tackle some other countries or areas. But you know, when I talk to this to people, they say, "What? You can use behaviour analysis to do that?" And the answer is, well, yes, of course, you can use it for pretty much anything. So we have a set of common values running throughout all of these things. We have a focus on behaviour, of course. We use behavioural strategies and tactics. We share a commitment to scientific evidence-based practices. And we address these socially significant issues. And there's a common training for this too. You know, this requires academic training in the science of behaviour analysis. This is not something that you can go and get from a weekend's training, even though you see many individuals advertise in such a way that suggests that you can have a weekend's training and go away and wreak havoc in the world. And it also requires some experiential and supervised experience to know how to apply the strategies and tactics that you are developing as skills. Which kind of brings me on to talking about the credential and the benefits of having a professional credential. And I think the fundamental benefit is about consumer protection. One of the reasons the BACB started is because of the growth in the number of individuals and organisations all over the world who suddenly came out of the woodwork to say, oh, we can offer ABA. So it's around ensuring that those that say that they are doing this have met a minimal level of requirements. There's a general accountability issue here as well. Once you get a professional credential, you are kind of beholden to the field, and people can and should hold you accountable, and they can and should complain to the BACB about you if you're not behaving competently or ethically. It ensures there's a quality and consistency across practitioners, wherever you are, all over the world. There's a portability issue. So those of you who may wish to pursue the credential, perhaps here, perhaps elsewhere, could potentially move anywhere, okay, within the constraints of the profession not being recognised. There are still many areas in the world where you could and should and would be welcomed to come and work as a behaviour analyst. And also, having a professional credential helps to establish professional identity. So, for example, one of the first questions we were asked in the UK when they said, well, okay, so you want to have this thing called behaviour analysis recognised, and behaviour analysts, who are they anyway? How do you define what a behaviour analyst is? Now, that's a complicated question. And that's a 3-hour presentation or a month module, or however you want to conceptualize that. But it's fairly easy to say to someone, oh, well, it's someone who has a professional qualification in that. And, oh, okay, fair enough. Right? Same with other professions. But of course, this is, just to stress, this is the professional credential just demonstrates that you have met a minimal level of particular standards. Okay, it doesn't guarantee you are going to be the best and most competent behaviour analyst ever. It's a minimal competence issue. Because ultimately, what we do, or at least whether we provide behaviour analytic services or not, ought to be determined by who we are in our training, rather than what is provided, right? So you wouldn't necessarily go into a school, look at something that's happening and say, oh, that's behaviour analysis, and then look at something else and say, that's not behaviour analysis. It ought to be defined by who's providing it. You wouldn't question a psychologist and say, well, that's not psychology, or a speech and language pathologist and say, well, that's not speech and language pathology, or a lawyer and say, oh, well, that's not law, right? Because this is what they're trained to do, and this is what we're trained to do. So behaviour analysts practice behaviour analysis, and behaviour analysts could or should be defined as someone who has been trained and holds a professional credential. So the BACB was started in 1998. It started, as I said, in response to the proliferation of services and individuals who were purporting to offer behaviour analytic services, but in many cases had little or sometimes no training. It's amalgamated a small number of existing certification programs in the US at the time, primarily the Florida program. And yes, its purpose was to provide evidence that people had met minimal levels of training and some experiential standards. Now, a couple of years ago, actually 3 years ago, I think, the BACB had a strategic planning meeting, and everyone on the BACB board agreed that international development should be a very important aspect of the BACB's work. And so we wrote a global mission and a global vision statement. So the global mission is to protect consumers of behaviour analysis services worldwide by systematically establishing, promoting and disseminating professional standards. And the global vision, which I'll just paraphrase for you, is saving the world with behavior analysis. All over the place. So there are 3 levels of certification. So we have a kind of high school level technician credential, the registered behavior technician, a bachelor's level credential, board certified assistant behavior analyst, and a master's level credential, board certified behavior analyst. To become a registered behavior technician, an RBT requires 40 classroom hours to cover these kind of fairly basic and straightforward areas, measurement, assessment, skill acquisition, behavior reduction, and so on. You must pass a competency assessment, so you must be able to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. You need a minimum of a high school diploma or the national equivalent. You must be 18 years of age or older, and you must be supervised. So these are not not independent practitioners. To become a BCABA, assistant level credential, requires 180 graduate classroom hours in behavior analysis, distributed, as I've shown on the slide, so a certain number of hours for ethics, a certain number of hours for concepts and principles, and so on. You need a minimum of a bachelor's degree, and you need to have completed 1,000 hours of experience, of which 5%, so 50 hours, is directly supervised. Not surprisingly, to become a board-certified behaviour analyst, so our highest level credential, requires significantly more coursework and pitched at a much higher level, so 270 postgraduate classroom hours. You need also a minimum of a master's degree, and not any master's degree. The master's degree must be in psychology or education or, of course, behaviour analysis. Now, why psychology or education? Well, because most of the behaviour analysis programs around the world are either within departments of psychology or departments of education. And so this is part of a shaping process that will probably, or probably should at least, end up with the requirement that you must have a master's degree in behaviour analysis. But that we are far too early in the field to introduce that, because that would shut down programs around the world. So there are not that many master's degrees in behaviour analysis around the world yet. Interestingly, there's one in Brazil that's situated right next door to the Department of Psychoanalysis, which kind of entertained me somewhat. I kind of wonder what happens when they go out to coffee together and kind of argue and then go back into their separate departments. Okay, you need 1,500 hours of experience, again, of which 5% is supervised. Now, to cover the coursework element of this, of course, you can do the coursework anywhere, but if you complete a course that's already been verified by us as having met the coursework requirements, then it's very easy for us to just approve that, because we've already kind of pre-vetted the coursework, if you like. And so there are a number of verified course sequences around the world. Currently, actually this is probably slightly out of date, 288 institutions around the world offer course sequences. And actually there are significantly more course sequences, because some of these institutions offer BCBA and BCABA online programs and classroom-based, brick and mortar programs. So there are more like 600 or possibly more courses. If we take out the ones from the United States, we're left with 85 institutions offering coursework in 36 countries around the world. And here is where they are, specifically. And the green ones are the European ones, and the one that's circled is where we are at the moment. Now, people often come up to me and say, well, there are all these different courses around the world. I'd really like to do the training. Could you recommend one? And I say no, because that wouldn't be ethical. I couldn't be seen to be saying, well, you should really do, one course here, but not that one there. So my advice would be to go to our website and look at our pass rate data and let the data speak for themselves. So pick a course that has really good pass rate data. And we display the data for any course that's been in existence for more than 3 years and has produced more than 6 test takers. Because if we were to display the data for less than that, it would be very easy to work out, I know those 2 that failed, because out of the 6, I'm pretty sure I know who they might be. So, that's why we do that. Once you've met the requirements, so you have the coursework, you've got the degree, you've completed the experience, then you apply to this organisation, Pearson VUE, who offer computer-based testing. And we use 400 test sites worldwide to sit the exam. So you could do the training here and then go to Hawaii or Japan or somewhere and take the exam if you wanted to.
We do the exam here.
Oh, and yeah, in Athens, yeah. You can do the exam in Athens. So no need to go to Hawaii. We currently have 4 test windows, February, May, August, and November. At some point, we'll move to on-demand testing, but we're not quite ready for that yet. Here's just to give you a feel of what the exam looks like. The BCBA exam is 150 questions, multiple choice questions. The BCABA exam is 132 multiple choice questions, and the RBT is 75. Now, if you are taking the exam and English is not your first language, you are given more time to do it. So it's 4 hours generally, but you get, I think you get at least another half an hour to do the exam if English is not your first language. And actually, we were talking about this recently, and it seems rather arbitrary to put a time limit on it anyway. I think maybe we should just let people take the exam and they take as long as they need. I don't know how practical that will be, though. The content of the exams comes from the task list, and the task list lists the knowledge, skills and abilities that we should have as behaviour analysts, and the task list is derived by the field, not by the BACB. So we facilitate that. We ask experts from all around the world to periodically review the task list, and then the BACB board gets to look at that and vote to accept it or not, but they can't change it. So it's the field that makes these determinations. And once the group of subject matter experts has come up with the task list, or a reviewed task list, that gets sent out to all of the certificants worldwide, plus faculty, plus course directors, and they get to look at every item and vote and get to say whether they feel that item is particularly important or not, and how frequently it's used. And we have a psychometrician that then analyses that data, and then that enables us to see whether some items probably ought to stay on the task list or come off the task list. Now, as an international organisation, of course, we should have the examination in languages other than English. And so we currently have the examination available in English, Spanish, Chinese, Hebrew, Italian, Brazilian, Portuguese, Korean, Russian, and very recently, Polish, with translations planned into Japanese, French, Arabic, and Hindi. Now, the reason we picked those languages, well, 2 reasons, really. One is that these languages represent about 85% of the population speak these languages. So that's pretty good coverage. And the other reason is that a number of countries that speak these languages are unable to take the exam until we have the examination available in these languages. So there's kind of groups building up in Russia and Brazil and China who really need to have the exam in their language before they can take it. Okay, the examination is not, well, some people have said to me, oh, the examination's really easy, the difficult bit is, doing the coursework and getting the experience. Well, I think the examination is a pretty good discriminator. Here are the pass rate data, which I think is incredibly stable. So the top line shows the percentage of people that pass the exam the first time they take it. That tells us that about 2/3 of people pass the first time. The lower line shows the percentage of people that pass when they retake the exam, whether it's for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th time. considerably lower. So the moral of the story here is just make sure you're very well trained and very well prepared before you take the exam. Don't mess it up, because if you do, your chances of passing it drops considerably. Similar data for the BCABA exam. Slightly different for the RBT exam. It's not designed to be a particularly tough exam, so the pass rate data are a lot higher. But again, if you fail it, the percentage of pass rate drops considerably. Okay, to date, we have 25,727 BCBAs around the world. And that's quite an astonishing and almost exponential growth. The reason why the last data point is not joined up is because we still have the November data to add to that from the November examination. So we could be around 28,000 by the end of the year. Considerably fewer BCABAs. I think that's probably because many BCABAs go on to become BCBAs. Now, the RBT credential is relatively new compared to the others, and we already have in excess of 32,000 of those. However, if we remove the US data, we're left with so 8% of us are outside the United States. Now, there's the same growth, but it's proportionately lower, of course, so about 8% of us are outside the US. So just to put this into some kind of global perspective, that red blob is the United States. And 92% of certificants live in the United States, but 95% of the population live outside the US. So there's a huge scope for growth there. Okay, so here are where the biggest groups are. Canada, Ireland, UK, Israel, and Russia. Is that Russia? No. I'll show you the list in a minute. Here are the so that's 100 plus. That's kind of 50 to 100. That's 11 to 50, and here's where everyone else is scattered. So we are pretty scattered. And here are the specific numbers. Again, the green is Europe, and the circle is here. So there are 8 certificants in Greece, or at least Greek certificants. I'm not sure they're all in Greece. In fact, they're not all in Greece.
Fourfold increase from the last time you were here.
Which is a 4-fold increase. Oh, that's pretty good. Okay, just to give you an idea of, well, we need to plan for growth, because dealing with the applications and the growing number of ethical concerns and complaints we get, it may well be that our organisation is going to have to continue to expand at quite a rate. And we already have, I think, 54 employees at the BACB now. 6 years ago, there was 3. So we're trying to project growth. So if we go back to 2016, where we have complete data set, we had 23,000-ish. That's a growth of 20 to 30% of new certificates per year. So if we conservatively assume that we're going to grow by 10%, then we're going to have 160,000 certificates by whatever that's.
2036.
Thank you, 2036. I need to get better glasses. Now, I think that's pretty astonishing growth, potentially. A couple of years ago, we surveyed our certificants to find out the areas in which they worked, or at least that they wanted to admit that they worked, and perhaps not surprisingly, the majority said they worked in the area of autism. But, there's many people working, in quite different areas. The standards are constantly evolving. So just to give you an idea of, since the BACB started in 1998, the coursework requirement has increased every 5 years or thereabouts. And from 2022, we'll be introducing exams based on the 5th edition task list, where the main differences are that there's going to be an extra 45 hours devoted to the philosophy of the science, which I think is fantastic. There's going to be more hours devoted to measurement and experimental design, and there's going to be specific hours devoted to personnel supervision and management. So there'll no longer be discretionary content. Similar increases with the BCABA, and again, the introduction of more hours devoted to the philosophy and basic principles is I think, a very welcome addition to this. And again, no discretionary content. Here are the content areas of the 4th edition task list. Those of you that have not seen this and would just like more information, if you go to our website, go to the documents section, download the task list, and you can look at all the knowledge, skills and abilities that a behaviour analyst should have. These are the areas. Similarly, you can download the professional and ethical compliance code, and here are those areas. If you are already a certificant, we give you access to journals for free. I mean, you just log on to the BACB account, and you can access JABA, JAB, many behaviour analytic journals. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.